My father heard me say 12 minutes. I know that because I still remember his voice coming through the radio. Copy that, Natalie. I was 34 years old, director of mountain operations and risk for Mercer Alpine Group, and I had spent nearly a decade teaching other people what to do when weather turned dangerous. That night, none of it prepared me for seeing the red taillights of our snowcat disappear through the blowing snow. My parents were inside. So was my younger sister, Lauren. I pressed the radio against my mouth. Dad, wait, I'm coming down. Static. Then my mother's voice broke through for half a second. Natalie always figures it out. And the signal died. The temperature was dropping fast. The upper pass was closing. I had no cell service, no overnight crew waiting for me, and the maintenance shelter 2 miles away was never meant to keep someone alive through a full mountain storm. But I survived. What I didn't understand then was why my parents waited 42 minutes before escalating the emergency response, or why the official report later claimed I had chosen to stay behind, or why, while I was still missing on that mountain, someone in my family had already begun asking questions about what would happen to my shares if I never came back. For 6 years, I told myself there had to be another explanation. Then, 90 days before my 40th birthday, my father called me for the first time in months. Natalie, he said almost warmly, it's time you came home. He thought he was inviting his daughter back. He had no idea I was about to find out why they had left me there in the first place. But to understand that call, you need to understand what happened on the mountain. Mercer Summit sat high in Colorado, one of 4 ski properties my family controlled through Mercer Alpine Group. The company liked to describe itself as a 3-generation mountain legacy. My father preferred the word dynasty. That week, senior management, lenders, and several board members had gathered at the Summit Lodge for what was supposed to be a strategy retreat. The following morning, Lauren was scheduled to sit beside my father at a private breakfast with 2 lenders. That evening, she was supposed to attend a dinner downstairs with several local reporters and hospitality investors. Lauren was 31 then. She handled partnerships, branding, and media. I handled the things that could shut down a mountain: avalanche protocols, lift evacuation plans, emergency staffing, weather thresholds, equipment failure. The unglamorous systems people only noticed when they stopped working. At 4:17 that afternoon, a sensor fault appeared at an upper mountain control station. Normally, I would have sent one of our technicians, but the technician assigned to that zone had already headed down because the forecast had worsened. My father found me near the operations desk. Natalie, I looked up from the weather display. The pressure had dropped faster than the noon model predicted. What? Upper station is throwing a fault. I saw it. We need to know whether it's the sensor or the line before we close tomorrow's terrain. The mountain is already moving into wind protocol. It'll take you 10 minutes. That was my father's way of asking. He never said please when competence was involved. He acted as if knowing how to fix something automatically volunteered you to fix it. Lauren appeared behind him wearing a cream sweater and boots that had probably cost more than my field jacket. Do we really need to stay up here much longer? She asked. My mother, Diane, immediately turned toward her. You're freezing. I'm fine. No, you're pale. Lauren gave me a small, embarrassed smile. She had always been the daughter whose discomfort became a family event. I had been assigned the opposite role. I was the practical one. The sturdy one. The one nobody needed to worry about. Those descriptions sounded like compliments until you noticed they were always followed by a request. I checked the weather screen again. I'll go. But Ben holds the cat at the upper pickup until I'm back. My father nodded. Fine. I pulled on my gloves. 12 to 15 minutes if it's just the sensor. My mother was already helping Lauren into her coat. Please don't make this longer than it needs to be. I almost laughed. Instead, I clipped the radio to my jacket and headed out. The wind sharpened while I crossed the upper traverse. Snow didn't fall so much as move sideways. By the time I reached the control station, visibility had dropped enough that I stopped twice to verify the boundary markers. The fault itself was simple. Loose connection. No damaged line. No system failure. I reseated the connector, ran the check again, then looked at my field watch. 6:43. I used a mechanical watch in mountain operations because batteries died, phones froze, And electronics had a habit of becoming unreliable exactly when people needed them most. I keyed the radio. Upper station to Mercer Party. My father answered. Go ahead. Fault isolated. No line damage. I'm returning to pickup. 12 minutes. A beat of static. Then, copy that. Clear enough that I never had to wonder whether he heard me. I zipped my jacket to my chin and started back. Halfway across the traverse, 2 red lights appeared below me through the snow. At first I thought Ben was repositioning the cat. Then the lights moved farther away. I stopped. The snowcat was leaving. I grabbed the radio. Ben, hold position. Static. Dad? The taillights kept moving. Mercer Party, this is Natalie. I am returning to pickup. Another voice cut across the channel. Dispatch. Mercer Party, confirm all riders accounted for? I waited. No answer. Then, several words came through under the static. My mother's voice. I could only make out the end. Natalie always figures it out. The rest disappeared. Dad, wait. For about 3 seconds, every instinct in me told me to chase the cat. That was the daughter in me. The operations director knew better. Chasing a moving vehicle downhill through deteriorating visibility would turn one bad decision into 2. I stood there watching the red lights fade. Then I forced myself to look away. Procedure first. Location. Weather. Available shelter. Communication. Exposure time. The maintenance shelter was a little under 2 miles east. The lower ridge route would have been faster, but wind was loading snow along that side and I wasn't willing to cross it alone. So I turned toward the longer route. My father had always told people I was calm under pressure. That night I learned something I should have understood years earlier. Being good in an emergency does not mean you aren't terrified inside one. My hands shook badly enough that I had to grip the radio with both of them. I tried twice more. No response. Eventually, even dispatch faded into static. The shelter emerged from the white about 40 minutes later. I knew the building well because I had inspected it before the season, and I knew immediately that something was wrong with the explanation I would hear later. There was no staff. There was never supposed to be staff overnight. It was a maintenance shelter, a metal door, an emergency heater, blankets, water treatment supplies, a battery unit, basic first aid materials. Enough to stabilize someone caught unexpectedly on the upper mountain. Not a lodge. Not an overnight station. Not somewhere anyone should deliberately choose to stay through a storm. I shut the door behind me and wrote the time on the back of an old inspection card. 7:28. My field watch became the center of my little world. Every 20 minutes I checked the radio. Every hour I checked my fingers and toes. I rationed the battery. I kept moving. I drank warm water. I wrapped myself in 2 emergency blankets and sat close enough to the heater to feel it without risking the fabric. And I kept telling myself the same thing. They were going to call patrol. Of course they were. Maybe Lauren had panicked. Maybe the road was worse than I realized. Maybe my father decided taking her down was the safest choice, and now that they were in reliable radio range, they would report exactly where I was. I could explain it. I had spent my entire life explaining them. My mother worried more about Lauren because Lauren was sensitive. My father depended on me because I was capable. Lauren got celebrated because she needed encouragement. I got responsibility because I had earned trust. That was the family math. By midnight, the wind was hitting the shelter hard enough to vibrate the wall behind my shoulder. I stopped trying to explain. I started counting minutes. Patrol found me after sunrise. The first person through the door was Tom Alvarez, one of our ski patrol supervisors. He took one look at me and said, "Natalie? I'm fine." He stared at me. "Of course you'd say that." My laugh came out dry and small. An EMT crouched beside me and began checking my hands. Tom looked around the shelter. "Were you here all night?" "Yes." "Alone?" "Yes." His expression changed. Only slightly. But I noticed things for a living. "What?" I asked. He glanced toward the open door before looking back at me. "I was told you were secure up here." "I was secure enough not to die." "That isn't what I mean." The EMT interrupted before I could press him. My fingers needed attention. My temperature was low. Questions could wait. Tom handed me a small incident card before they moved me. "Keep this. It had the case number handwritten across the top. Why? If you ever want the complete record, safety can pull it by that number. I slid it into my jacket. At the hospital, they treated me for cold exposure and mild frostbite in 2 fingertips. I was lucky. That word followed me for weeks. Lucky. Lucky patrol found me. Lucky the shelter heater worked. Lucky I knew the mountain. Lucky the exposure wasn't worse. Nobody seemed interested in the other side of luck. Someone had left me there. My parents arrived after I had been warmed, examined, and moved into a quieter room. My mother came in first. Oh, sweetheart. She rushed to the bed and reached for me. I let her hug my shoulders, because at that moment I was still enough of the daughter I had always been to want it. My father stood behind her. Lauren lingered near the door. You scared us half to death, Mom said. I looked at her. The sentence felt wrong. You left. Her arms loosened. Natalie, you heard me say 12 minutes. My father stepped closer. We thought you checked in at the shelter. No. You made a professional call to stay up. I stared at him. I told you I was coming back. You know what conditions were like. So did you. Lauren folded her arms across herself. I thought Dad had called patrol. My father turned. Lauren. What? I did. Mom touched my blanket. Your sister was panicking. The pass was closing. We had to make a decision. There it was. The family equation again. Lauren needed them. I could manage. My father's voice softened, which somehow made it worse. You were the capable one up there, Natalie. I waited. I wanted one sentence. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that required tears. Just, we should have come back for you. My mother talked about weather. My father talked about procedure. Lauren talked about what she thought someone else had done. Nobody said it. Then my father told me company counsel would handle the incident. I turned toward him. Why would company counsel handle my medical information? They may need records for insurance and communications. A woman from hospital administration had left a medical release form on the tray beside me. I picked it up. For years, if my father handed me a form and said it was routine, I signed. That morning, my fingertips hurt when I bent them. I put the form back down. No. Dad frowned. No. My medical records don't go to PR. This isn't about PR. Then nobody will have a problem waiting until I review what they're requesting. Mom closed her eyes. Natalie, please don't turn this into something. I looked at her. I almost froze overnight. Nobody answered. I signed nothing. That was the first boundary. Small enough that nobody outside that hospital room would have noticed. Large enough that my father did. 4 days later, Marin Cole from Corporate Safety emailed me the preliminary incident report. I read it twice. Then a third time. The sentence appeared halfway down the page. Natalie Mercer, elected to remain at upper maintenance shelter, and confirmed adequate overnight provisions. I sat very still at my kitchen table. I could hear the refrigerator running. A delivery truck changed gears outside. Ordinary noises. I read the sentence again. Elected to remain. No. I had said 12 minutes. Confirmed adequate overnight provisions. No. I had never confirmed any such thing. The shelter wasn't even staffed. I opened a blank email. I did not accuse anyone of trying to hurt me. I did not write about betrayal. I did what I had trained hundreds of employees to do after an operational incident. Facts. Time. Sequence. Correction requested. I wrote that at approximately 6:43, I radioed my intention to return to the pickup point within 12 minutes. I wrote that the maintenance shelter was not staffed overnight. I wrote that I had never elected to stay and had never confirmed adequate overnight provisions. Then I attached no theories. Only facts. Before sending it, I photographed my field watch beside the handwritten inspection card I had carried out of the shelter. I scanned Tom's incident card. Then I sent the correction. My father called 11 minutes later. You filed a formal correction? Yes. For God's sake, Natalie. I leaned back in the chair. What part is wrong? That isn't the point. It is to me. You're turning a family mistake into a corporate liability. A family mistake. Not our mistake. Not my mistake. A family mistake. Then the report should describe the mistake accurately. His breathing changed. That was how my father sounded when someone in a meeting refused to accept his framing. You're emotional. I wrote 3 factual corrections. You could have called me. I did call you. Silence. Neither of us needed to say where. I ended the conversation first. I saved the preliminary report, my correction email, the incident card, the photograph of my watch. Then I closed the folder. At the time, I wasn't building a case. I was protecting my memory from people who had already started rewriting it. I went back to Mercer Summit the following week to collect my things. The doctor had cleared me for light work, but I had already decided I wasn't staying. I just hadn't told my father yet. The operations corridor smelled exactly the same. Coffee, wet gloves, machine oil. The radio system crackled during a routine test. Static filled the hallway. My fingers went cold. Not actually cold. The building was warm, but the 2 fingertips that had been injured tingled sharply, and for one strange second I could see red taillights disappearing through white snow. I stopped walking, put my palm against the wall, counted to 5, then kept going. Maya Ortiz found me emptying my desk. She managed workforce planning for 2 of our resorts and had known me for 7 years. "You're leaving." It wasn't a question. "Yes." She closed the door. "They briefed managers this morning." I looked up. "About what?" "The incident." Something in her face made me put down the box. "What did they say?" "That you chose to remain at the upper shelter because you believed travel conditions were unsafe." I felt something inside me go very quiet. "Did they say the shelter was staffed?" Maya hesitated. "Yes." I nodded once. "Thank you." "Natalie, I'm not asking you to choose sides. I know. If anyone ever asks what you heard in that briefing, just tell them exactly that." "I will." I carried my box into the hallway. On the wall outside the conference room hung a new presentation board. Lauren Mercer Safety Modernization Initiative. I stopped. 3 phrases were mine. Not similar. Mine. Language I had written into our winter operations manuals years earlier. Lauren had never worked mountain safety. I stared at the board longer than I should have. Then I laughed once under my breath. Of course. Apparently I could even be useful after leaving. My father called before I reached the parking lot. I approved 6 weeks paid leave. "I'm resigning." Silence. Then, very softly, "Don't be ridiculous. My letter is already with HR. This is your family's company." "I know. Family doesn't walk away from family." I looked through the windshield toward the upper ridge. For most of my life, that sentence would have worked. Then I remembered red lights disappearing in snow. "I'm not the one who taught us otherwise." I ended the call. I left my office key with HR. I took only my personal notebooks, my employment records, my own correspondence, and the things that belonged to me. No confidential archive. No secret files. No grand revenge plan. I drove away from Mercer Summit with 1 cardboard box in the passenger seat and no idea what came next. That evening, sitting on the floor of my apartment because I hadn't bothered turning on most of the lights, I opened my laptop. There was an annual notice from the administrator of a family trust my grandfather had created years earlier. I nearly archived it without reading. Trust paperwork had always been background noise in our family. Something my parents managed. Something for later. I opened it anyway. Most of the language meant very little to me then. Beneficiary notices. Administrative reporting. Voting shares. Distribution schedule. Then, one line caught my eye. Outright distribution to Natalie Mercer upon attainment of age 40. I was 34. 6 years. I looked at the number for a long time. At the time, I couldn't have explained why it bothered me. Maybe because 6 years suddenly felt less like a birthday countdown and more like a clock someone else had started. I closed the laptop. Across the room, my field watch was lying beside the incident card, still ticking. And for the first time since the mountain, I wondered whether the worst thing my family had done was leaving me behind, or making sure everyone believed I had chosen to stay. 6 years turned out to be long enough to build a life, and not nearly long enough to stop hearing static. The first winter after I left Mercer Alpine, I took a job with a resort nearly 4 hours away. It was smaller than anything my father considered important, which turned out to be one of the things I liked about it. Nobody there knew me as Richard Mercer's daughter. They knew me as the woman who asked why an evacuation map showed a service road that had been closed for 3 seasons. During my second month, I sat through a training exercise, while a supervisor explained how his team would clear the upper lodge during a wind shutdown. He spoke confidently until I asked where his overnight maintenance crew would assemble. He pointed toward a section on the map. That access route. It's locked after 9. His finger stopped. The room went quiet. Nobody laughed. Nobody accused me of overthinking. Nobody told me I was making things harder than they needed to be. The supervisor leaned closer to the map. You're right. 2 words. That was all. We rewrote the procedure before lunch. For years, Mercer Alpine had trained me to expect expertise to become obligation. If I noticed the problem, I was expected to solve it quietly, make everyone else look competent, and be grateful for being needed. At the new resort, finding a problem was simply part of my job. They paid me for it. More importantly, they listened when I said the solution required more time, more people, or more money. That distinction felt almost indecent at first. A year later, another resort hired me to review its emergency plans. Then another asked me to audit winter staffing. By the end of my second year away, enough work was coming directly to me that I stopped pretending I was only freelancing between jobs. Northline Mountain's safety and resilience began with a rented office, 2 folding desks, and a coffee maker that leaked from the bottom. Serena Cho joined me 6 months later. She had worked in emergency planning for a county transportation department and possessed the useful habit of asking one question after everyone else thought the meeting was finished. On a Tuesday afternoon in our 3rd winter, we sat across from the operations team of a Wyoming resort reviewing evacuation logs. A manager insisted their overnight procedure had been tested. Serena slid the training records toward me. Only day shift employees had signed them. Rather than correct him immediately, I asked, "Who was in the building when you ran the drill?" He looked down. 3 seconds later, his confidence changed shape. That was the kind of work I understood. Not blame. Sequence. What was known? What was assumed? What had actually happened? Northline eventually grew to a handful of employees and enough recurring contracts that I stopped checking the business account every morning before buying office supplies. My townhouse came later. Nothing extravagant. 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, a small deck facing a line of pines. The deed carried only my name. The first night there, I slept on a mattress on the floor because the furniture hadn't arrived. At 2 in the morning, wind moved through the trees and rattled the vent above the bedroom. For one disorienting second, the sound became radio static. My fingers tightened around the blanket. The 2 fingertips that had suffered frostbite years earlier sometimes tingled even when the room was warm. Doctors had told me the nerves might remain sensitive. I had learned that memory could do the same thing. The sensation passed. Eventually, I learned not to fight it. Feel the chair beneath me. Name the room. Find the window. Look at the thermostat. Breathe until the mountain returned to being 6 years ago instead of now. The locked cabinet in my office still contained the incident report, my correction email, Tom Alvarez's incident card, and photographs of my field watch. They were records, not relics. Most weeks I never opened the drawer. That mattered to me. Leaving Mercer Alpine had not become my profession. My profession was what I built afterward. My parents contacted me occasionally. Birthdays. Christmas. A message when somebody in the extended family got married or died. My mother preferred sentences that could be read 2 ways. We hope someday you'll stop punishing everyone. My father was more practical. There's still a place here when you're ready to be reasonable. Loren sent shorter message. Usually photographs. A new lodge. A magazine cover. An industry award. Sometimes there was no caption at all. For a while, I answered politely. Eventually, I stopped answering anything that required me to defend why I had left. That was another boundary I had learned slowly. Not every accusation required a closing argument. Then, in early spring of my 6th year away, Maya Ortiz sent me an industry article. Her text said only, "You should probably see this before somebody sends it to you," with a smiley face. The headline called Lauren Mercer, the architect of Mercer Alpine's modern safety culture. I read the article at my desk while Serena worked through a vendor contract across the room. Lauren looked polished in the photograph, standing in front of the main lodge at Mercer Summit. The article described a series of modernization efforts launched after a challenging operational period. 3 phrases stopped me. They were mine. Not broad industry language. Mine. A layered evacuation model I had named during my 20s. A winter redundancy framework. Even the phrase accountability before movement, which I had written after watching a lift team dispatch, before confirming that every technician had cleared the line. My first impulse was uglier than I liked. Open the company website, find every archived manual, post them next to the article. Let dates do the talking. The impulse lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Then I closed the browser. Serena glanced over. Bad news? Old news wearing new clothes. She waited. One of the reasons I trusted her was that she did not fill empty space for me. My phone buzzed again. Maya had written, "They renamed your work. They didn't replace it." That sentence stayed with me longer than the article. Mercer Alpine could remove my name. It could not invent 10 years of operational knowledge overnight. I downloaded a copy of the article and added it to my professional records because the material established something useful about my authorship. Then I went back to the vendor contract. No public accusation. No revenge post. No midnight message to Lauren. If they needed my absence to make their story work, I wasn't going to spend my life auditioning for a place inside it. Still, one detail bothered me. The article called Lauren the company's future chief executive more than once, but it never explained how control of Mercer Alpine would actually pass. For someone being presented as inevitable, she seemed strangely disconnected from the machinery that would make her powerful. I noticed it, then I moved on. 90 days before my 40th birthday, an email arrived from Helen Price, the administrator handling my grandfather's trust. The subject line read, "Distribution Preparation Notice." I almost filed it for later. Trust correspondence had always occupied the same corner of my mind as property tax notices and retirement disclosures, important, legitimate, and unlikely to change the next hour of my life. Then I remembered the line I had read 6 years earlier. Outright distribution upon attainment of age 40. This time I opened every attachment. By lunchtime, the conference table in my office was covered with printed schedules, ownership charts, and language I understood individually, but not collectively. 34% voting interest. Trustee authority. Distribution event. Remainder provisions. Contingent beneficiary. Reading risk documents had taught me that confusion was often useful information. It told you where somebody else had more control than you did. I called Helen. "I want someone independent to walk through the full schedule with me before distribution." "That's completely reasonable," she said. "Someone who hasn't represented Mercer Alpine or my parents." Another brief pause. "Also reasonable." She gave me several names. I chose Elise Warren because her biography contained nothing about rescuing dynasties and a great deal about fiduciary accounting. 2 days later, we sat in a small conference room in Denver. Elise placed the trust schedule between us. "What do you understand so far?" "That I receive 34% of the voting shares when I turn 40. "Yes. Until then, my parents vote them as co-trustees, subject to their fiduciary obligations." I nodded. "And if I had died before 40? Her eyes dropped to the page. The pause was short. Still, I felt both damaged fingertips begin to tingle. Elise turned the document toward me and pointed to the relevant section. "The shares would not have passed freely through your estate. They would have moved into the Mercer Family Remainder Trust." "For whose benefit?" "Your sister is the next named beneficiary." "And trustees?" "The current structure keeps Richard and Diane Mercer in trustee control unless another triggering event removes them." The room seemed to lose sound. No dramatic revelation came with it. No music. No voice in my head announcing what it meant. Just paper. 34%. 40 years old. Lauren next. My parents still controlling the votes. 6 years earlier, I had been 34. A capable woman sitting 2 miles from an unstaffed shelter while her parents drove away. Elise folded her hands. "I want to be careful here. A contingent provision is normal in many trusts. Its existence does not tell us anything about what happened on that mountain." "I know, and I did." The part of me that had survived by procedure took over before the daughter in me could build a conclusion from pain. "What can I request as beneficiary?" "In what regard?" "Trustee inquiries. expenses, reviews, connected to this share block, anything showing when the contingent provision was discussed or analyzed. That would require a formal accounting request. Can I make one? Yes. Then I want to. Elise studied me for a moment. You understand that a request like that may change the tone between you and the trustees. The tone already changed 6 years ago. She slid the paperwork over. The pen was mine. So was the decision. I signed. 3 evenings later, my mother called. Not texted. Called. Natalie. Her voice had the careful warmth people use when setting something fragile on a table. Hi, Mom. Your father and I have been talking. That sentence had preceded a remarkable number of obligations during my childhood. I said nothing. We think it's time you had your proper place again. My hand stopped over the saucepan on my stove. Proper place. There it was. The tiny phrase. Some part of me had been waiting years to hear. Not come. Fix something. Not stop embarrassing us. A place. What does that mean? I asked. You should talk to your father. Naturally. Richard joined the call a few minutes later. Lauren appeared briefly on the group screen from what looked like an airport lounge. Dad wasted little time. When your trust distributes, the voting structure becomes unnecessarily fragmented. Mine becomes mine. Nobody is disputing that. He said it with the patience of a man explaining why ownership and control were different things. We're preparing a Mercer family voting agreement. The family block stays aligned on major governance questions. You retain the economic value of your shares. Who directs the block? Continuity provisions would keep leadership centralized. That wasn't my question. A pause. I would remain coordinating member for an initial term. There it was. My shares. His vote. Mom leaned toward the camera. This isn't about taking anything from you. Dad continued. You'd come in as president. The word landed harder than I expected. For most of my 20s, I had watched him introduce Lauren to investors while assigning me responsibility without title. President. He kept going. You'd nominate 2 directors. Your safety systems would receive formal company attribution. We'd put one resort directly under your operating oversight. And Lauren? Dad glanced toward her little square on the screen. Lauren remains the designated chief executive successor, a familiar structure wrapped in better paper. I would carry operations. Lauren would inherit the crown. Have you read the voting agreement? I asked her. Lauren's expression changed. Dad handles ownership structure. You're supposed to become chief executive. I handle the business side I'm responsible for. Dad cut in. This isn't an interrogation. No, I said. It's a document I'm being asked to sign. Mom exhaled audibly. Natalie, why does everything have to become so formal with you? Because informal had once left me on a mountain. The answer rose instantly. I didn't say it. Send me the entire proposal in writing. Dad's jaw tightened. We can discuss it as a family. We just did. Now send it in writing. Another boundary. Nothing theatrical. No slammed phone. No threat. Just a refusal to negotiate ownership through a conversation they could later remember differently. The documents arrived the following morning. I forwarded them to Elise unopened. Then I went to work. That afternoon, Northline's newest client had a staffing problem at a remote lodge, and for several hours Mercer Alpine disappeared behind schedules, shift rotations, and evacuation capacity. That was becoming the strangest part of returning to my past. My present kept interrupting it. I had built something that demanded I remain alive in my own life. A week later, Elise called. The first accounting material came in. Her tone was neutral enough that I put down my coffee. What did they produce? Trustee billing ledger. Activity summaries. Some administrative entries. We'll need support documents before drawing conclusions. Read me the relevant ones. Paper moved at her end. 2 days before the Mercer Summit retreat, there is an entry for a consultation requested by Richard Mercer. Subject. She hesitated only long enough to make sure she quoted it correctly. Contingent beneficiary and distribution event review. The office around me remained exactly the same. Serena was laughing quietly at something one room over. A printer started. Someone closed the front door. 2 days before the mountain. Not after. Before. Elise continued. There's another entry the morning after you were reported missing. What does that one say? Succession, contingency consultation. The mechanical watch on my wrist suddenly felt too tight. Who requested it? The summary attributes the activity to trustee administration. We need underlying records before saying more. Request them. Natalie, I'm not asking you what it means. That came out sharper than I intended. My voice lowered. I want the supporting records for every expense tied to those entries. Whatever the accounting process entitles me to receive. All right. And decision records connected to the voting block. We can request them. Do that. After the call ended, I opened a notebook. No accusations. No conclusions. Only dates. Trust inquiry. Mountain retreat. Incident. Succession. Consultation. The order bothered me more than any individual entry. An accident can explain what happens afterward. It has a harder time explaining preparation beforehand. I still needed another record. The one I had avoided for 6 years. Mercer Summit looked smaller when I drove back. Memory had made the access road steeper, the lodge darker, the ridge farther away. The actual buildings were just buildings. Maya met me near operations. Her hug lasted exactly long enough to feel genuine and not long enough to become a scene. You sure about this? No. Good answer. I requested the certified incident archive. Tom knows. The patrol room had changed its furniture but not its radio system. A dispatcher ran a routine check as I entered. Static snapped through the speaker. My fingers went numb. Not from temperature. The room was warm enough that somebody had cracked a window. For a moment, the walls seemed too close. Rather than pretend nothing was happening, I pulled out a chair. Sat. Placed both palms flat on my thighs. The field watch ticked against my wrist. Tom Alvarez came through the doorway, took one look at me, and stopped. Need a minute? Yes. He waited without asking whether I was all right. A minute later, my breathing belonged to the room again. Okay. Tom placed a certified packet on the table. We pulled the full dispatch archive tied to your incident number. I opened it. The first familiar line appeared almost immediately. My transmission. Fault isolated. 12 minutes. Returning to pickup. Then the acknowledgement. Then vehicle movement. My eyes moved down. Lower zone signal restored. Dispatch contacted Mercer Party. Family representative stated Natalie Mercer was remaining in staffed upper shelter. I looked at Tom. That shelter has never been staffed overnight. No. You told me that the morning you found me. Yes. The next timestamps were separated by 42 minutes. My mouth went dry. What happened here? Tom leaned over, careful not to touch the page. Dispatch asked whether to elevate you to an overdue person response. The note says the family representative maintained that you had shelter and had made a professional decision to remain. Twice? The dispatcher queried twice. And 42 minutes passed before full response was authorized? That's what the record says. Do you remember it? I remember the delay because we were already watching the weather deteriorate. He did not tell me what my parents intended. He did not need to. The record told me what had happened. What they knew about my return time. What they told dispatch. How long they allowed that story to stand. I requested certified copies and signed the receipt myself. Outside the lodge, Lauren was walking toward the entrance with 2 people from the marketing team. She stopped when she saw me. Mom said you were coming back. Not exactly. Her eyes moved to the packet under my arm. What are you doing? Reviewing a record. Dad said the trust stuff is paperwork. Do you know what happens to my shares if I die before 40? For the first time since I had known her, Lauren looked at me without a ready answer. What? The 34%. She glanced toward the lodge. I don't know. Dad handles that. You're his designated successor. That doesn't mean I read trust schedules. Apparently it did not. The golden child had been shown the stage. Our father had kept the lighting controls. I left without explaining the clause. That evening, 2 documents sat side by side on my kitchen table. On the left was the accounting entry dated 2 days before our mountain retreat. Contingent beneficiary and distribution event review. On the right was the certified dispatch record. 42 minutes. 6 years separated the woman who had survived that mountain from the woman sitting at the table. The numbers did not care. For the first time, neither did the timeline. They belonged to the same story. They belonged to the same story. That realization did not make the story complete. It only meant I finally knew what question to ask. The next morning, I arrived at Northline before anyone else and rolled the conference room whiteboard away from the wall. At the top, 3 columns went up in black marker. What they knew. What they did. Who benefited. Nothing else. No accusation. No word for motive. Certainly not murder. That word would have made the board feel dramatic and useless. My work had taught me that once people fell in love with a conclusion, they started forcing every fact to serve it. I needed the opposite. The first column took less time than I expected. 2 days before the mountain retreat, my father had requested a review involving the contingent beneficiary provision and the distribution event attached to my trust. On the mountain, he heard me say I was 12 minutes from the pickup point. He knew the upper shelter was a maintenance structure, not an overnight station. Under the second column went the snowcat departure, the claim that I had chosen to remain, the statement to dispatch that the shelter was staffed, and the 42-minute delay before the overdue person response was fully escalated. Under the third column, I wrote only what the trust document allowed me to prove. If I died before 40, the 34% voting block moved into the Mercer Family Remainder Trust. Lauren became the next beneficiary. My parents remained in trustee control. Serena came in while I was standing 6 feet from the board with a cup of coffee going untouched in my hand. She read the headings. Then the dates. That's a lot to look at before 8 in the morning. I've had 6 years. She set her bag down. What do you need from me? Corroboration. Not sympathy. All right. That was all she said. No demand that I explain the mountain again. No assurance that she knew exactly what my parents had intended. She moved to her desk and opened the Wyoming proposal we were supposed to finalize that morning. 2 hours later, the trust timeline was still on the wall when Serena appeared in the doorway. The Casper client needs the revised winter staffing numbers by noon. For a second, irritation rose in me. Then gratitude followed it. Give me 10 minutes. Northline had existed before I reopened the trust records, and it would exist after them. My parents had already taken one night on a mountain, and too many years before it. They were not getting every business hour I had built without them. The Wyoming contract was signed before lunch. Only after the client call ended did I check the message from Elise. Formal accounting review produced additional support for the trustee expenses. We should meet. The word support made my stomach tighten. Not proof. Not guilt. Support. That was enough to keep me careful. Helen Price joined us by video the next afternoon. Elise had several documents spread across the conference table. Before we start, she said, there are limits here. Privileged legal communications do not become available just because you're a beneficiary. Understood. What we do have is material produced through the accounting review to support expenses charged to the trust and administrative actions taken with the voting block. Helen nodded from the screen. The administrator was required to identify the basis for certain governance-related expenses. Elise slid one document toward me. The heading read, Succession Contingency Memorandum Draft. My pulse moved into my throat. The creation date was the morning after I had been left on the mountain. At that hour, I had still been missing. The memo did not say anyone wanted me dead. It did not mention the decision to leave me. It did something more restrained and, in its own way, more disturbing. It described how the Mercer voting block would be handled upon contingency event prior to scheduled distribution and assumed the 34% would remain under family trustee control. A list of recipients appeared in the metadata. Richard Mercer, Diane Mercer, Outside Governance Council, Paul Mercer, my uncle. Paul had served on the board for more than 20 years. He was my father's younger brother, and one of those men who could spend an entire dinner agreeing with everyone by saying almost nothing. What did this cost the trust? I asked. Helen gave me the amount. It was not large. That made it worse somehow. Planning for the possibility that I would not come back had been ordinary enough to bill by the hour. Paul received this while I was missing? That is what the distribution record indicates, Elise said. Then I want to ask him about it. Elise started to speak. This is not you interviewing him for me, I said. I know. A small nod. Good. Paul agreed to meet in the cafe of a hotel near Denver International Airport. He chose the place because he was flying out that evening. I suspected he also liked the fact that nobody there cared who the Mercers were. The memorandum stayed inside my bag. No need to announce what I had before he spoke. He stirred his coffee for a long time. You look like your grandfather when you're angry. I'm not here for genealogy. No. Did you receive a succession contingency memo the morning I was missing? His spoon stopped. Yes. Did you know before that trip what happened to my trust shares if I died before 40? No. The answer came quickly enough that I did not know whether to trust it. What did Dad tell you? Paul looked toward the windows. That the weather was bad. That you hadn't come down. He said the board needed to be ready if you weren't recovered. Was I presumed dead? No. Had patrol stopped searching? No. Then why were you planning succession? His jaw tightened. I didn't draft it. That isn't what I asked. A waitress passed our table. Neither of us spoke until she was gone. Paul finally said, Richard said uncertainty was the risk. The voting bloc was large enough that governance couldn't be left unresolved. There it was. Even my possible death had been translated into corporate continuity. Did you ask why the trust had already reviewed the contingency clause before the trip? No. Why not? His eyes came back to mine. Because your father had run the company for decades, and when Richard said there was a continuity issue, people handled the continuity issue. You included. Yes. No excuse. That almost earned more respect than an apology would have. Why tell me this now? Paul leaned back. Don't confuse this with courage, Natalie. I wasn't planning to. If Richard's current governance proposal goes through and then the trust review turns against him, every director who nodded along becomes part of the story. I intend to be able to show exactly what I knew, and when I knew it. So you're protecting yourself? Yes. Good. He blinked. You expected me to be offended? I expected you to want loyalty. I've had enough loyalty that requires people to lie. The corner of his mouth moved, but not into a smile. Before he left, Paul confirmed one more thing. My father had not told him the details of the contingent beneficiary clause until after I disappeared. Richard had controlled the information even among his own board. That mattered because it left me with another question. How much had Lauren actually known? She answered it herself, 3 days later, by asking to meet. Not at my office, not at Mercer Summit. A quiet restaurant halfway between Denver and the mountains. I don't want this becoming a public circus, she said before the server had even taken our drink order. You asked me here. I know. She looked older than the woman in the industry photographs. Not dramatically. Just enough that I could see the 6 years between us two. You're reopening everything. I'm reviewing records. You know what I mean. Yes. Lauren folded the edge of her napkin. Did you really ask Dad about the trust? I asked you a question at the lodge. You didn't know the answer. Because I don't manage the trust. You're supposed to inherit leadership of a company whose largest concentrated voting bloc you don't understand. Dad handles ownership. What do you handle? The brand. Partnerships. Development. And he handles control. She looked at me. That's how it's always worked. The sentence was so revealing because she did not seem to realize it was. Did you know that if I died before 40, you became the next beneficiary? No. Did you know Mom and Dad retained trustee control? No. Did you know they had asked about that provision before the mountain trip? Her face changed. No. Nothing in her reaction proved innocence. Surprise was not evidence. So I kept to what she could actually tell me. On the snowcat, did you ask them to go back? Lauren looked down at her hands. Yes. The answer came quietly. What happened? I said we should wait. For how long? I don't remember exactly. Did they tell you I had chosen to stay? Mom said you had shelter. Staffed shelter? She said someone would be there. Nobody had been. What did Dad say? That the road was closing and turning around could risk everyone. My hand tightened around the water glass. Did you hear me on the radio? Some of it. 12 minutes? A pause. I remember you saying you were coming back. For 6 years, she had never told me that. The anger that came with it was strangely clean. You let them tell everyone I chose to stay. Lauren's mouth tightened. I was told the incident review had settled that. You knew I said I was coming back. I knew what I heard in bad radio conditions. Convenient. That's not fair. No. Fair would have been you asking me what happened. Her eyes hardened. I was 29, Natalie. And I was 34, alone on a mountain. We sat with that. No one at the surrounding tables looked our way. Real damage rarely had the soundtrack people imagined. Finally, I asked, "Why didn't you ever learn how the ownership worked?" She gave a short, humorless laugh. Because Dad hated those conversations. That never stopped me. No, it got you punished. That landed. Lauren looked toward the window. He told me my job was to carry the brand. He handled control. Every time I did what he wanted, I got another introduction, another title, another project. So you decided not to ask. Her eyes returned to mine. Because every year I didn't ask, I got more of what I wanted. There was no redemption in the sentence. Only accuracy. She had not known everything. She had also benefited from not knowing. Both could be true. If this review reaches the board, she said, are you going to protect me? From what? From being treated like I planned this. I won't say you knew something I can't prove you knew. Relief flickered across her face too soon. But I'm not going to protect you from what you did know. Her shoulders stiffened. You really have changed. No, I finally stopped doing the editing for everyone else. That evening, I added Lauren's account to my notes with the source clearly marked. Not as proof of motive. As corroboration that my parents had known I intended to return. That Lauren had asked whether they should wait, and that the explanation about a staffed shelter had existed before the public incident report. The next missing piece was older than the mountain. Paul had once mentioned a lodge our grandfather lost when my father was 17. Until then, it had been one of those half-stories adults repeated at holidays. This time I checked the company archive. An old shareholder letter carried my father's signature from years before I joined Mercer Alpine. One paragraph was underlined in the archived copy. Control must remain sufficiently concentrated to ensure the Mercer name cannot again be removed from the properties it built. I read it twice. Then I remembered a sentence from childhood. At dinners. After acquisitions. Whenever somebody suggested outside investment. Never let control leave the family. Paul filled in the rest by phone. When my father was 17, 2 older relatives had sold enough of a struggling lodge to outsiders that the Mercer family lost control. Within a year, the property was renamed. Richard had watched workers remove the Mercer sign. For the first time, I could see where his obsession had begun. That did not make the 42 minutes disappear. Understanding the origin of a system did not make the system harmless. It only explained why my father might look at money, votes, daughters, and danger, and still see the same thing. Control. The invitation arrived the following morning. Private dinner at Mercer Summit. My mother called it a way forward. The dining room had changed since I worked there. New chairs, new lighting, same mountain framed in the windows. Dad placed a leather folder in front of me. Mom sat to his right. Lauren sat farther down the table. We've spent too much time fighting, my father said. I've spent most of that time working. Diane gave me the look she used when she wanted a conversation to stay pleasant. Please. Richard opened the folder. The offer was better than anything he had ever given me. President of Mercer Alpine. 2 board nominations under my control. Formal attribution for the safety systems I had created. Direct operating oversight of 1 resort. A public announcement, naming both daughters as the future of the company. For a few seconds, I could barely hear him. President. My systems under my name. My place stated in public where nobody could edit me out. It embarrassed me how much I wanted it. Not the office. Not even the authority. The recognition. Nearly 20 years of being told Lauren was the face, while I was the dependable hands, had left a wound I had learned to work around rather than heal. My mother touched the edge of the folder. We're giving you your place back. There it was. The sentence some younger version of me had spent half her life earning. My thumb rested against the paper. Then I turned the page. Family voting agreement. Centralized coordination under Richard Mercer for an initial term. Next page. Waiver of claims arising from prior trustee administration. Another page. Mutually approved public statement regarding the mountain incident. The proposed wording called it a family misunderstanding during severe weather conditions. The room sharpened around me. What does the trust waiver have to do with my becoming president? Dad's expression barely changed. We need finality. If the mountain was a misunderstanding, why do you need me to waive claims about the trust? Mom leaned forward. Natalie, this is exactly what we're trying to stop, pulling every sentence apart. That's how contracts work. This isn't just a contract, she said. It's us. That had always been the problem. When they wanted my labor, we were a family. When they wanted my signature, suddenly the document was only paperwork. Lauren stared at the folder but said nothing. Dad pushed a pen toward me. We are offering you everything you said we never gave you. He was right. That was what made it dangerous. How long do I have? Why do you need time? Because you're asking for my votes, my legal rights, my public version of the mountain, and my silence about trustee conduct. His eyes hardened. I'm asking you to come home. Then 48 hours shouldn't hurt. I left without signing. The next morning, Serena had a staffing proposal waiting on my desk. 3 employees needed decisions before winter scheduling could move forward. A client wanted our final resilience assessment. Someone had left a blueberry muffin beside my keyboard. Nothing in the room required me to surrender my memory before I was allowed to belong there. That realization hurt more than I expected. I called Maya. One question. Go. If Richard left tomorrow, could Mercer Alpine operate? She did not answer immediately. Operate. Yes. Cleanly? No. Why? She gave me exactly what I had asked for. Turnover rates, maintenance backlogs, department heads already carrying responsibilities above their titles, lender concerns about succession uncertainty. No opinion about what I should do. Just the system. Elisa's call came next. She explained the practical effect of the waiver and voting agreement in plain language. Signing would not prove my parents had done nothing wrong. It would narrow my ability to challenge what had happened and put my voting power back into a structure my father coordinated. What do you want me to tell them? She asked. Nothing. A pause. Nothing? I'll tell them. The email took 3 minutes. I will enter no governance agreement until the trustee review is complete. Then I authorized formal preservation requests for the trust and governance records relevant to the disputed voting block and requested independent review of any trustee vote involving a conflict before distribution. After sending it, I opened another document. The Northline lease. Our landlord had offered a 3-year extension 2 weeks earlier. I had delayed signing because some part of me had begun treating my life as temporary again. As though Mercer Alpine might call, and the real world would resume. The pen moved across the signature line. 3 more years. Northline's address. My company. My work. My place. Nobody had given it back to me because nobody there had taken it away. At 4:16 that afternoon, an email from Mercer Alpine appeared. Notice of special board meeting. The date was set before my 40th birthday. The agenda included a family governance restructuring affecting concentrated voting interests. My father had given me 48 hours. Then he had decided not to wait for my answer. For 6 years, Richard Mercer had treated time as something he controlled. On the mountain, it had been 12 minutes, then 42. Now he was racing the final days before the 34% became mine. The special board meeting notice arrived at 4:16 in the afternoon. By 4:20, it was printed beside my notebook. By 4:30, the first version of my response was already wrong. It was angry. Not in language. I had spent too many years writing incident reports to put anger on paper. The problem was the objective. Every page I drafted assumed the same thing my father did, that there were only 2 possible outcomes. Richard controlled Mercer Alpine. Or I did. That was still his map. I closed the document and walked into Northline's conference room. The whiteboard from the week before had been cleaned, but faint shadows remained where I had written what they knew, what they did, who benefited. 3 columns had helped me understand the past. They were not enough to design the future. Serena came in carrying a laptop. You canceled the 4 o'clock? Moved it to tomorrow morning. That client hates mornings. They hate bad risk models more. She sat down. What are we building? Something my father won't expect. Maya joined by video from Colorado. Elise called in 10 minutes later. No one was asked to save me. They had narrower jobs. Elise would make sure the steps I chose stayed inside the rules. Maya would give me workforce numbers I could verify. Serena would attack my assumptions until whatever survived could stand in front of a skeptical board. The strategy began with the immediate problem. My parents were still co-trustees of the 34% voting bloc until distribution. The proposed restructuring would let them use those votes on a transaction that directly affected how my shares would be controlled afterward. That conflict needs to be raised before the meeting, I said. Elise nodded on the screen. We can request independent review and challenge use of the trust block on that specific vote while the accounting review remains open. Do it. Do you want an emergency court filing prepared as backup? Prepared, yes. Filed only if they force the issue. That distinction mattered. Court was not the plan. It was a guardrail. The real work was mine. For the next 2 days, Mercer Alpine stopped being my father's company in my head. It became a system. A system had debt, insurance requirements, deferred maintenance, lender expectations, employee turnover, leadership concentration, single points of failure. Those were things I knew how to measure. Maya sent vacancy data from mountain operations, maintenance, and guest services. Several senior employees had been carrying duties above their titles for more than a year. The turnover in technical staff is worse than the reports show, she told me. Why? Reports count filled positions. They don't show experience lost. So quantify experience. She did. Serena took my first projections and tore through them. You're assuming Richard leaves cleanly. He may not. You're also assuming Lauren stays. She may not. Then model both. By midnight, the problem had changed shape. Mercer Alpine was not fragile because one Mercer might leave. It was fragile because too much authority had been designed around the assumption that a Mercer would always be there. That was not continuity. That was concentration risk wearing a family crest. The document I eventually titled the Mercer Alpine Stewardship Plan did not mention the mountain once. That surprised even me. It proposed an independent board chair, an open search for the next chief executive, no automatic succession based on surname, measurable standards for any Mercer who wanted an executive role, and a gradual expansion of employee ownership through independently valued transactions. The last section was the hardest. After my shares distributed, I would keep a meaningful investment, but I would not preserve the 34% as a personal throne. A substantial portion of its voting concentration would eventually move into the new governance structure through a properly valued sale or transfer process, subject to financing and approvals. Serena read that page twice. You understand what you're giving up? Yes. You could become the largest single power center in the company. Yes. You don't sound thrilled about it. That's the problem. She waited. I looked at the numbers again. If the only proof that I escaped my father is that I get to become my father, then I didn't escape much. The sentence stayed in the room. That night, Northline's office was nearly empty when I turned off the conference room lights. My lease extension sat in the filing cabinet. 3 more years. For the first time since the board notice arrived, I slept through the night. The independent directors agreed to review the stewardship plan before the special meeting. They did not congratulate me. That helped. One of them, Margaret Sloan, had spent 20 years in hospitality, finance, and possessed the expression of a woman who considered enthusiasm a suspicious accounting category. She tapped the ownership section. You're about to receive a very large voting position. Yes. And your proposal reduces long-term concentration. Yes. Including your own. Yes. Why? Because the company needs governance that survives the family. Her eyebrow moved slightly. That is not an answer lenders can underwrite. Fair. I opened the next page. Then use this one. The stress tests showed what happened under 3 different leadership transitions. Richard stayed. Richard left, and Lauren succeeded automatically. Richard left, and an independent executive search began with temporary operating authority, distributed among existing senior leaders. The third scenario created short-term disruption. It also produced the lowest concentration risk over 3 years. Maya presented employee retention data without praising me or attacking my father. Serena walked them through the assumptions. Questions came for nearly 2 hours. Nobody promised support. Margaret closed the binder. Get us lender compatibility on the revised governance model before the special meeting. I will. Outside the room, Maya touched my sleeve. You expected applause? No. Good. You looked disappointed. I'm learning to enjoy adulthood. She laughed. The lender response came the following afternoon. Not approval. Conditional compatibility. Independent chair. Defined management transition. No interference with debt covenants. Quarterly operational reporting. The same things I had expected. For once, ordinary conditions felt like good news. The special meeting took place 4 days later at Mercer Summit. Snow lined the windows, but the sky was clear. That almost annoyed me. Some childish part of me had expected the mountain to understand symbolism. It did not. Mountains were better than people that way. They did not change themselves to flatter your story. Richard sat at the head of the board table. Diane had been given a seat along the side wall as an invited shareholder representative. Lauren sat beside my father, close enough to look like Succession, and far enough from the documents to confirm everything she had told me. Paul was already there. He gave me a small nod. Nothing more. Maya attended as the employee ownership representative. Elise sat behind me, not beside me. That placement had been my choice. My father noticed. His opening presentation lasted 23 minutes. Mercer continuity. Market uncertainty. Outside influence. The danger of fragmented voting. The value of a recognizable leadership identity. Then he reached me. Natalie has spent 6 years outside Mercer Alpine, he said. She has every right to build a successful career elsewhere. But returning now and reopening settled events should not be allowed to destabilize a company that employs hundreds of people. Settled events. My fingertips tingled. I placed both hands flat on the table. The sensation passed. Richard continued. He described the proposed voting agreement as a compromise. My economic rights would remain mine. Leadership would remain coordinated. The company would avoid what he called a destructive struggle between branches of the same family. When he finished, he pushed a familiar leather folder toward me. The same folder from dinner. The same offer. President. 2 board nominations. Public credit. Direct operating authority. And the same cost, hidden behind warmer language. He placed a pen on top. Take your place, Natalie. For nearly 20 years, those words would have ended the conversation. That morning they clarified it. My place had never been the issue. His permission had been. I left the pen where it was. You said I'm rewriting history. Richard leaned back. I said we should not destabilize the company over competing interpretations. I brought 4 facts. A page came out of my folder. Only one. No stack designed for theater. The trust distributes 34% of Mercer Alpine voting shares directly to me when I turn 40. At that point, your trustee voting authority over those shares ends. No one interrupted. 2 days before the mountain retreat 6 years ago, a trust expense records your request for review of the contingent beneficiary and distribution provisions affecting those shares. My mother shifted in her chair. Natalie, please let me finish. Her mouth closed. While I was still missing, trust-funded succession contingency work began. A draft memorandum circulated on the assumption that my voting block might remain under trustee control if the contingency provision was triggered. Richard's expression did not change much. He had always been good in boardrooms. So far, he said, you've described responsible contingency planning. Then the 4th fact should be easy. I turned the leather folder toward the board. 6 years later, the offer in front of me requires 3 things together. I accept a title. I place my votes into a structure coordinated by my father. And I waive claims about trustee conduct while publicly describing the mountain incident as a misunderstanding. Margaret Sloan looked down at the agreement. I did not raise my voice. I can prove what they knew. I can prove what they did. And I can show who benefited. I am not asking this board to decide what was in anyone's mind on that mountain. My father's jaw tightened. Then what exactly are you asking them to decide? Whether the same people under review for how they handled my voting interest should be allowed to use that interest today to preserve their own control. Paul cleared his throat. Every face turned toward him. I received the succession memorandum, he said. Richard looked at his brother. Paul continued before anyone could stop him. Richard told me conditions were severe and that we might need to plan as if Natalie would not be recovered. I did not know about the trust provision before that. I also did not ask why planning had begun as early as it did. Dad's voice went flat. You are mischaracterizing a continuity discussion. I'm characterizing what I did, Paul said. Nothing more. That was exactly why his statement mattered. No conversion. No heroic uncle. Just a man protecting himself with the truth once lying had become more dangerous. Lauren spoke next. I didn't know about the death provision. Richard turned to her. This is not relevant. She looked at me instead. I knew she said she was coming back to the pickup. The room felt smaller. Mom's chair scraped softly against the floor. Dad stared at me. Then the restraint broke. Not into a confession. Into doctrine. You have no idea what it takes to keep something like this intact, he said. Every decision I made was to keep this company in the family. There it was. Not proof of what he wanted to happen to me. Something broader. The rule under everything else. I looked at the board. That is precisely the problem. The leather folder slid back across the table toward him. I will not sign the voting agreement. I will not accept the president title under these conditions. When the shares distribute, they will not enter a Mercer family voting block. My mother whispered, You would throw away your grandfather's legacy out of spite? No. The stewardship plan came out next. I brought an alternative. Richard laughed once. It was not amusement. You've been outside this company for 6 years, and yet my safety systems are still in your manuals. No one spoke. I continued. Independent chair, professional chief executive search, no automatic succession, measurable standards for every executive, including me, expanded employee ownership through independent valuation, reduced voting concentration over time. Lauren stared at me. You're giving away control. I'm refusing to build the same cage with my name on it. Richard stood. You think lenders want an experiment? The compatibility letter is in Appendix 3. That stopped him. Nay! Not because the plan was guaranteed. Because it was no longer theoretical. The board recessed. Nobody knew what to say in the hallway. Elise asked whether I wanted water. Yes, that was the full extent of her rescue. Maya stood near the window, reading messages from employees who did not know what was happening upstairs. Serena texted, Whatever they decide, Casper signed. I smiled. Northline had just closed a multi-year resilience contract with 2 resorts outside Mercer Alpine. My life had moved while my father was still trying to freeze it in place. The board returned after nearly an hour. They did not hand me the company. That would have been absurd. They postponed the family restructuring. They required independent review before the trust block could be voted on any conflicted transaction. They opened a formal governance review. They directed management to prepare a transition plan compatible with lender requirements. The stewardship plan would move forward for evaluation alongside any competing proposal. It was procedural. Boring, almost. It also changed everything. Richard no longer controlled the clock. That was the first moment I knew the balance had shifted. Not when he raised his voice. Not when Paul confirmed the memo. When my father could no longer make time itself obey him. The following weeks were full of ordinary work. That was important. Northline hired another analyst. The Wyoming project moved into field testing. I approved a new benefits package Serena had been arguing for since January. Trust accounting continued in the background. An independent administrator was put in place for the distribution period while the conflict review proceeded. No one was led away in handcuffs. No judge gave a speech. Paper moved. Authority narrowed. Deadlines arrived. Then so did my birthday. 40. Helen called at 9:12 that morning. The distribution is complete. For several seconds, I said nothing. 34% of Mercer Alpine voting shares were now legally mine. 6 years earlier, that sentence would have sounded like vindication. Instead, I looked around my office. A half-dead plant Serena refused to let anyone throw away. A stack of client folders. My Northline lease framed only because she had found it funny that I kept rereading it. That room felt more like ownership than 34% of anything. The first phase of the stewardship plan moved forward later that week. Under an independent valuation process, I committed part of my holdings to the expanded employee ownership structure over time and retained a substantial minority investment. I supported the independent chair process. I signed onto an open chief executive search. The governing documents removed automatic family succession. Nobody named Mercer would inherit operational control simply by remaining alive long enough. Lauren could compete. So could I. So could someone whose last name meant nothing at all. That afternoon, Helen sent the final confirmation packet. Another email arrived almost immediately after. Northline had secured the multi-year resilience agreement for the 2 independent mountain properties. For once, 2 futures sat on my desk, and neither required me to choose one in order to deserve the other. My father called before sunset. I considered letting it ring, then answered, "What?" His breathing filled the line. "You killed the Mercer legacy." Outside my office window, late summer light rested on the foothills. My field watch lay beside the keyboard. Still working. Still keeping time for me instead of anyone else. "No," I said. The words came without anger. I stopped feeding it people. Then I ended the call. Ending the call did not feel like victory. It felt like setting down something heavy and discovering my hands still remembered its weight. For most of that week, nothing dramatic happened. Northline had a field review due outside Steamboat. Serena needed my approval on 2 hires, and one of our clients had discovered that winter readiness apparently meant waiting until the first hard freeze to ask whether half its backup batteries still held a charge. Ordinary work saved me from making Richard's last sentence more important than it was. The formal notices began arriving 9 days later. The independent accounting review did not accuse my parents of some grand criminal scheme. It did something less theatrical and more useful. It identified several trust expenses and conflicted governance charges that could not properly remain where they had been placed. The recommendation required restoration of certain amounts and a reasonable surcharge connected to the conflicted process. They were not ruined. They kept their house, investments, club memberships, and the life they had built around being Mercer people. What changed was authority. Richard's transition out of the chief executive role became official before the winter operating season. Diane lost her committee positions, connected to succession and trust oversight. The voting bloc my parents had treated like an extension of themselves no longer existed. The new governing documents removed automatic succession based on bloodline. A surname could still appear on an application. It just could not serve as a qualification. The first time I read that sentence in the approved governance packet, my thumb rested against the edge of my field watch. For 6 years, I had used time to prove what happened to me. Now time was doing something simpler. It was moving. Diane did not accept the change quietly. I knew that because my phone began filling with messages from people I had not heard from since Christmases when I still sat through dinner pretending not to notice that Lauren's career was discussed as a future and mine as a useful function. An aunt wrote, "Your mother says you've dismantled everything your grandfather built." A cousin asked, "Was there really no way to handle this privately?" Someone else sent 3 paragraphs about loyalty, followed by a heart emoji, which felt ambitious. The old reflex arrived immediately. Explain the trust. Explain the dispatch log. Explain the false shelter statement. Explain the 42 minutes. Explain that I had not taken the company. My fingers were already moving when I stopped. The message box held 4 lines. Then 3. Then none. I deleted the draft and set the phone face down. That choice was smaller than a board vote and harder than several of them. Diane still had an audience. She no longer had the only record. That was enough. Lauren disappeared from Mercer Alpine for almost 3 months. I learned that from the management transition report and, later, from Lauren herself. Her name reappeared in my inbox on a Tuesday afternoon. "Can we talk?" No explanation, no accusation. I almost suggested a video call. Instead, I gave her the name of a coffee shop halfway between Northline and Mercer Summit. Neutral ground had become one of my favorite luxuries. She arrived wearing a camel coat and no makeup, which would have been unremarkable on anyone else. On Lauren, who had spent years knowing exactly where cameras might be, it made her look younger than I remembered. She ordered tea and held the paper cup between both hands. I applied for brand director. The position had appeared in the open search packet the week before. Partnerships, destination marketing, media relations, brand strategy, work she actually knew. That makes sense, I said. Her eyes narrowed. That's it? What were you expecting? I don't know. Maybe you'd tell me not to. That isn't my job. She looked down at the lid. The hiring committee has 2 people who hate Dad. They're independent directors. That's not the same thing. No, it's better. Her mouth tightened. Then came the question I had been expecting without wanting to admit it. You're not even going to help? There were a dozen ways I could have answered. 6 years earlier, I might have built her interview packet, rewritten her resume, called someone on the committee, and told myself I was doing it because sisters helped each other. 6 months earlier, anger might have tempted me to do the opposite. Neither choice belonged in the system I had fought to build. I recused myself from the process, I said, completely. Lauren stared at me. So you're just going to let them decide? Yes. You could make one call. I could. And you won't. No. The teacup creaked softly under her fingers. That feels like punishment. It isn't. It feels like it. I'm not going to hurt you, Lauren. I'm also not going to carry you. She looked toward the window. Outside, wet snow was dissolving into gray slush along the curb. For a while, the only sound between us was the espresso machine. Then she said, I made the shortlist. A laugh nearly escaped me. Not because it was funny, because her irritation had hidden the most important fact. Then, apparently you can do this without me. She looked back at me, and something in her face shifted. Not gratitude, not reconciliation, just the discomfort of finding an edge where there had never been one before. We talked for another 20 minutes. No childhood inventory. No forced apology. Before leaving, she put on her coat, then stopped with one hand on the chair. I should have made them turn around. The coffee shop seemed to lose sound around that sentence. For 6 years, I had wanted something almost like it. Not from her, from them. My throat tightened anyway. Yes, I said. Lauren waited as though there might be more. There wasn't. She nodded once and left. I sat there until the tea she had abandoned stopped steaming. Her sentence mattered. It did not repair the mountain. Both things could be true. Diane called 3 days later. I let it go to voicemail. Her message lasted a little over 2 minutes. She said relatives were confused, that the company had become unrecognizable, and that I was allowing outsiders to turn a disagreement into a permanent fracture. Near the end, her voice softened. You've made your point, Natalie. At some stage, a daughter has to decide whether being right matters more than having people. That line stayed with me longer than I wanted, not because I believed it, because some part of me had spent most of my life believing the inverse. Having people mattered enough to be wrong about myself. No reply went out. The next morning, Serena found me in the conference room, studying a personnel coverage map. You look like you slept badly. I slept fine. You look like you slept fine in a hostile way. That may be my face. She set a folder beside me. New Mexico wants the winter resilience scope expanded. By how much? Enough that you'll complain, and then say yes to half. Excellent. We've developed a process. She left me with the folder. The personnel map stayed open on the wall. Names, roles, backup contacts. Who was on the mountain? Who had checked out? Who was still exposed if weather turned? No one's surname changed the procedure. That was the kind of legacy I could live with. Richard asked to see me in early spring. Not through Diane. Not through Paul. He sent an email to my Northline address, with one sentence. 30 minutes. Somewhere neutral. I chose a lodge cafe outside Frisco where neither of us owned anything. He arrived 5 minutes early. So did I. For the first time in my life, there was no Mercer table waiting for me, and no chair someone else had decided was mine. He sat across from me with a black coffee he barely touched. Age had become more visible on him over the past year. Not collapse, just details I used to miss when authority filled the room before he did. A crease beside his mouth, silver at his temples. A slight stiffness when he took off his coat. You look well, he said. So do you. He almost smiled. Then he looked out the window. You could have run all of it. There was no greeting left after that. That was never the point. You say that now. I said it when I refused the presidency. You refused my version of it. Yes. His fingers closed around the coffee cup. Your grandfather spent his whole life keeping control from being scattered. My grandfather also wrote a trust that gave me those shares outright at 40. That trust assumed judgment. So did I. His eyes came back to mine. For a moment, I could see the old boardroom instinct in him, looking for the weakness in the sentence. There wasn't one. He spoke more quietly. I was trying to keep what we built. The words should have made me angry. Instead, they made me tired. The accounting was done. The shares had distributed. The governance had changed. There was no tactical reason left to ask the question that had followed me through every document, every meeting, every night when wind pushed against my townhouse windows. That was exactly why I asked it. Why didn't you come back? Richard did not answer immediately. A server walked past with a tray of mugs. Someone laughed near the fireplace. My field watch ticked beneath my sleeve. He looked down at his coffee. I thought you'd make it. There it was. Not the sentence I wanted. Not an apology. Not even a denial. Just the belief that had been wrapped around me since childhood like praise. Natalie can handle it. Natalie figures it out. Natalie is the capable one. Survival had been converted into permission. That's not the same as choosing me, I said. His jaw shifted. Natalie, no. The word came out gently. I asked once. He stopped. So did I. There would be no cross-examination until he produced a better father. No second attempt phrased more kindly. No explanation from me about why the right answer had mattered. After a few minutes, I stood. He remained seated. At the door, an old instinct asked me to look back and check whether he was all right. I kept walking. 14 months later, my life had acquired the kind of boring details I once thought belonged to other people. My townhouse finally had curtains I had chosen instead of temporary blinds. Serena kept a basil plant alive in Northline's kitchen through sheer intimidation. We had 9 full-time employees, a rotating bench of field specialists, and contracts spread across several mountain properties. Some weeks, Mercer Alpine appeared on my calendar. Some weeks, it did not. When it did, the scope came through procurement like any other client. Deliverables, rates, access, deadlines. No one wrote because you're a Mercer in the contract. That absence still pleased me. My minority stake remained an investment. Board packets came to me on schedule. I read them, voted when required, and closed the files. Lauren eventually got the brand director role. The hiring committee's notice made clear that she had won it after the full process. I sent her one message. Congratulations. She replied, thanks. That was all. It was more honest than many of the conversations we had grown up calling closeness. The storm reached Mercer Summit in late January. Northline was on site for a resilience audit that week, which meant I was in the operations center when the wind crossed the threshold for Upper Mountain shutdown. Snow scraped against the windows. The personnel board glowed on the wall. Radios crackled from 3 desks. Static brushed the room. My fingertips tingled. The sensation came and passed. No one noticed. Or if they did, they had learned the useful skill of letting another adult manage her own body. The operations manager traced the board with one finger. Last guest sweep is clear. Patrol is coming down. Maintenance? 2 techs, still above timberline. They're finishing the sensor lockout. My eyes moved to the 2 names still marked active. The weather alert updated. Wind increasing. Visibility dropping. A driver's voice came over the radio. Ops. Last cat is loaded. Do we send? For half a second, 6 years collapsed into one sound. Static. A dark traverse. Red taillights moving away. My father saying, copy. Then the room returned. Warm console under my palm. Personal board in front of me. My watch keeping ordinary time. I picked up the radio. Negative. Hold the last cat. The driver answered, copy. Holding. The operations manager looked at me. Conditions are closing fast. I know. We've got room to wait, but not much. Then we use the room we have. He nodded and turned back to his screen. New argument. No one called me emotional. No one told me the two people above were experienced enough to figure it out. 7 minutes later, the radio cracked again. Ops, Timberline maintenance. We're clear of the station. Moving to pickup. Copy, I said. Confirm when you're aboard. Another few minutes. Wind pushed hard against the building. Then came the voice I was waiting for. Last two accounted for. Both aboard. The operations manager reached toward the departure control. I raised the radio one final time. Last cat, you're clear to descend. Copy that. On the personnel board, the final two names changed status. Accounted for. The word did not look dramatic. It never had. That was the point. My field watch ticked against my wrist as the snowcat started down with everyone inside. Being capable had saved my life once. For years, the people closest to me had treated that fact as proof that leaving me behind had not cost enough. I no longer needed them to understand the difference. The system I helped build understood it. No one was written off because they were strong. No one was abandoned because they were likely to survive. And nobody left the mountain until everyone was accounted for.